Good evening. I'm David Shadrick with Calamity News and Politics, and this is our first podcast ever. And so I thought I'd start our inaugural podcast off and talk a little bit about the protests and demonstrations you've heard about in Portland, Oregon, where I happen to live. And so I just kind of thought I would clue you in on how things work here in Portland. I can't remember a time when there haven't been protests in Portland. There seems to be a protest almost every week, for as far back as I can remember, and most of my friends can remember. Back in the early 60s, civil rights movement, they had protests. Vietnam War protests. They had protests when Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon. They had protests for Reagan, for every kind of war over in the Middle East, and oil and Gaddafi. And I can remember I used to work downtown during the first Bush administration, and they had a picture of the presidential limo being driven away while a small group of Secret Service agents held back a crowd of people that were chasing the car, flipping it off and screaming at them. So then they came the neo-Nazis. The gentleman who broke Geraldo Rivera's nose on television was a neo-Nazi from here in Portland. There was a group of skinheads that were against racial prejudice. So there were constantly these race problems going on, the Crips, the Bloods, all these protests that went on when I was down there through all the Republican administrations, and then, of course, Trojan nuclear power plant. I guess what I'm trying to say is that unlike other cities, Portland is under a constant state of protest, and we don't usually have any kind of problems with our protests. So if we look at a timeline of recent events and how things got to be where they are, this started with the George Floyd protests, which of course started out as a typical Portland, Oregon protest. But somehow our president decided that they needed to send federal troops to protect the courthouse because the police weren't doing enough. So they sent in these outside people, which of course you've heard about, the famous police that had no identification, no units, throwing people into unmarked cars, beating people with batons, the whole nine yards. So that necessitated a withdrawal of the federal troops to ramp the tensions down. So things started to calm back down. And then all of a sudden, again, outside people decided that Portland, Oregon needed their help with a problem that they're well aware of and know how to handle. So a bunch of people from out of state brought their guns. And when you hear about the escalation in Portland, Oregon, we live in Portland don't look at it as an escalation of what's happening in Portland. What we look at is that a person from out of state may or may not have threatened someone else from out of state with a knife, and the person from out of state threatened with a knife had a gun and shot them. So that to us is not a Portland problem. This is outside agitators. And I don't understand why you think you need to leave your state and bring your guns to Oregon. To me, it doesn't make sense. I think that if you want to get involved, you should. You should be involved in the protest no matter which side you're on. But you have to take the axiom, think globally and act locally. If you're from Illinois, don't come to Portland. Why aren't you in Chicago? If you're from Washington, why are you in Portland? Why aren't you in Seattle, if you're from California, Idaho, why aren't you in your hometown? And why are you bringing weapons to a protest? Neither side is helping the police. You're just making it horrible for the police, because now there's a bunch of armed crazy people where there used to be just, peaceful protesters. So stay home, do your protests in your local neighborhood. Just be there as a body, whatever side you're on. When they look out at the thing and they see you standing there, they know where you stand. You don't need a gun over your shoulder to prove that. So let's stay home, stay out of other people's business, and let's get everything de-escalated, not only in Portland, but across the country. All right, everyone. First broadcast of a podcast. So I'm hoping this works out well, and I'll see you again next week. This is David Shadrick for Calamity News and Politics. Have a great day.